Welcome to The 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, and today I'll be talking with Sasha Vasilyuk about her book about her grandfather's experience in World War II, Your Presence is Mandatory.
How would a Jewish soldier that's captured by Germans able to survive the entirety of the war? And so before I even set out to write it, I started asking that question. And that is obviously a very Jewish question. The difficulty of finding the answer is also a very Jewish experience.
Sasha Vasilyuk is a journalist and author of the debut novel, Your Presence is Mandatory. She grew up between Ukraine and Russia before immigrating to San Francisco at the age of 13. She has an MA in journalism from New York University, and her nonfiction has been published in the New York Times, Harper's Bazaar, Los Angeles Times, Time, The Telegraph, USA Today, and elsewhere. In this episode, Sasha shares that the war in Ukraine inspired her to write about the war of her grandparents' generation.
I realized at a certain point during a trip I took to the Donbass that World War II was not this thing that happened that's in history books, but it is being actively used and weaponized by Putin's regime in Russia against Ukraine.
She also shares what reading Yaa Gyasi's Homegoing taught her about slavery's impact on American history and life today.
And for me, even though I lived in the U.S. since I was 13, and I've taken plenty of classes that dealt with the question of African Americans and their history in this country, and yet none of that had the same effect as this book. And none of it explained America to me as this book did.
All that and more coming up next. Welcome to The 5 Books. Sasha, I'm so happy to talk to you today about your book, Your Presence is Mandatory. It won the 2025 Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, which was such a well-deserved honor. The organizers described your novel as exploring the hidden costs of war, the legacy of silence, and the complex moral terrain of Jewish life in the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Ukraine. I think the prize really just honored the way your book is both intimate and sweeping. It's a story about one man's secret and how that is expansive enough to illuminate an entire overlooked corner of Soviet Jewish history. So I'm really excited to talk to you about it today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Talia. It's great to be on this podcast.
So tell us just a little bit about the book, Your Presence is Mandatory. And I know there's a piece of it that's connected to your family history. So maybe you could just tell us about how this project began.
Absolutely. So this is a fictionalized account of my grandfather, who was a Ukrainian Jew who never talked about two things. One of them being World War II and what happened to him in the 4 years that it lasted. And second one being his Jewish identity, roots, language, anything essentially connected to it. It's only after he passed away in 2007 in Donetsk, Ukraine, which is in the very currently disputed region of the Donbass, that our family discovered a letter that he'd written and left behind, purposefully or not, it's unclear, but a confession letter addressed to the KGB, where he revealed the answer to the first thing he never talked about, which is World War II.
Can you tell us about the letter that your family found and what was in it?
Yeah, so the letter is kind of copied in almost nonfiction way in the first chapter of the book. So the book opens with a scene of the discovery of this letter. The letter is very short. It was written in the 80s. It's addressed to the KGB. It is an answer, clearly, to a summons. And it's very short. It's about a page and a half. My grandfather kind of going through what happened to him as he remembers it. He's writing it 40 years after the fact. And it's very non-emotional, with one exception. It's very much, I was there, and then I was captured, and then I ran away, and then this happened. It has places and dates. The one emotional part is a sentence. I'll read it to you. So kind of as he's confessing all this, he says, "I must first say that my children and grandchildren love me very much and it would be a big psychological trauma for them to find out what I'm about to report. It's a slightly edited version of what my grandfather really said. And at the time, I was in my 20s. I immediately thought that there was a novel there. I always wanted to become a writer. I never tried writing a novel or really fiction. I was doing journalism. And all of a sudden, there's this tremendous story that I, like in my taste in literature, kind of checked two main boxes. One is interesting things happen, interesting and unique things happen. And then the second was that he kept this experience a secret for decades. I found that kind of the moral and psychological dilemma of a man who experienced this tremendous story of survival and then has to keep it a secret, sort of very novelesque. So it had these two components of like plot and, psychological moral questions at the heart of it. However, I did not write this novel for another 10 years because I didn't think I was cut out for it. I don't know that I felt that there was like a specific urgency to writing yet another World War II book. I just felt so overwhelmed by the amount of like films and books on the subject. It's also a story of a soldier in some ways and of a veteran. And what the hell did I know about either? And then what changed for me was that this thing called a war that I was sort of convinced we left, at least as a European society, we mostly left in the 20th century. And I strongly associated with this thing that our grandfather's generation kind of dealt with, but we were modern, this modernity that couldn't return. In 2014, it did return. And not only did it return in some corner about which I knew very little, it returned to the city of Donetsk where my grandparents lived, where I'd spent every summer growing up. I was born in Ukraine, then we moved to Russia, then we immigrated to the US. Throughout all of these years, I always went to visit them. And all of a sudden, this was kind of at the center of war, not only war kind of in Europe in the 21st century, but war between the two countries where I grew up. It's still, when I think back to it, even though it's now been going on for 11 years, it's just unthinkable. And so all of a sudden, war as a concept was back, seemed urgent and relevant and interesting. But also, I realized at a certain point during a trip I took to the Donbass that World War II was not this thing that happened that's in history books, but it is being actively used and weaponized by Putin's regime in Russia against Ukraine. And it was done very purposefully and in a very sort of obviously like visual way. There were posters all over the city that visually looked Soviet and that kind of recalled the trauma/heroism of the Soviet Union prevailing and winning over Nazi Germany, now against the people that did the suffering in the first place. And it was just so bizarre, and I didn't realize it was happening because it wasn't part of the story that was covered in the Western media. So it took me being there and seeing it to kind of realize that World War II is not an event in the 20th century about which we write history books. It is something that is extremely relevant.
Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood. An Airplane Went Flying by Friedrich Gorenstein. What's it called in Russian?
Lетит себе аэроплан. It's a fictionalized story of Chagall's life. It's written by a Soviet Jewish writer who at some point left the Soviet Union because I don't think he was getting published there very much. His name is Friedrich Gorenstein. And I came across it. Somebody handed me this book.
When you were a kid?
Young adult. And it looked beautiful. I was into art history. Of course, I knew Chagall by then, although maybe not deeply, but I didn't really know that much about him. And all of a sudden I picked up this book and it begins with his birth, which doesn't maybe sound exciting, except the opening scene is a fire and a shtetl. And it's very dramatic, and he's portrayed as being born during this fire. So there's like his mom is giving birth, buildings are burning. Anyway, it's just very, very cinematic, very dramatic. And it was my first encounter with the shtetl and sort of what characters' names that were unusual, because most of the Jewish names were Russified later in the Soviet Union. So I've never met people with names like that. And then proceeds all the way sort of from birth until his death. It was a beautiful book, and somehow it was just really striking. As I was sort of preparing for this podcast, I was thinking why this book, of all the other possibilities, kind of struck me. And I reread the intro just a couple of days ago, and it talks about how Chagall, he lived for a very long time, until 98. And he lived through this like most dramatic part of human history, which is the 20th century. As a Jew, it begins with fire, and then we proceed through the pogroms and immigration and war, and everyone around him is essentially dying. And yet he lives. And there must have been some seed planted in my brain, because that is exactly what happens to Yefim in my book later, right? So that question of why does somebody survive when everyone else around them doesn't, what that does to a person, the guilt they carry around it, and like, why them? Okay, Marc Chagall, I get it, he definitely had some sort of angels protecting him. But why my grandfather and not some other grandfather? So, and I think that is, especially when you deal with the 20th century as a writer, that is often the central question. The other thing that I got as a maybe budding writer from the book is that it's possible to take someone's life, A, in its entirety and portray it in an interesting way, and B, to fictionalize it, and that's okay. Because previous to that, I read novels, like Anna Karenina, who was not a real person. And here I was like, oh, this is a real person. Apparently some random guy could just write a book and fictionalize his life, and it gets published and it looks beautiful. And while I think I realized that this is not like an official biography of Marc Chagall, I don't think that made it less interesting, perhaps more, frankly. It was just so vivid, and it did things that nonfiction can't do and that journalism cannot do.
I so appreciate the way that it speaks to your own book. If you could tell us a little bit about your own background. I know you came to the U.S. at 13.
Absolutely. I was born in Crimea, which was part of Soviet Ukraine at the time. Then we moved to Moscow, and I attended school in Moscow. When I was 13, we immigrated to San Francisco. And by we, I mean, a part of the family. Most other relatives stayed in either Ukraine or Russia. So every trip I took to visit them included both countries. I did not know that I was Jewish until sometime in the early 90s, so after Soviet Union fell apart. And I think I was probably maybe in third grade. What I remember is going to a Purim party. I had no idea what Purim was, but I think this was a clever way for my mother to tell me, like, hey, you're part of this thing and it's really fun, and it involves costumes. And, age appropriate way to tell me. And I remember there were all of these people. There was a family with 6 children, which is not something I've ever encountered before, because typically in kind of Soviet space, you have like 1 or 2. But I've never met anybody with more until then. And yeah, it was just this other world, and they all seemed to know what Purim was, and they were really into it. And then afterward, I went to a Jewish summer camp in Russia and absolutely loved it. Mostly we partied, and I've never been to an American Jewish summer camp, so I assume it's similar, but I don't know. Maybe once I send my kids to one, they'll tell me if it's similar. But I was like 11 and a half. So it's kind of preteen, and it was just super, super fun. But it gave me a sense that that there's this other world, that I got to be part of the world, that none of the people in my school were part of this world. And mind you, I went to a school in Moscow. It is, I think maybe to this day, I don't know, the biggest school on the European continent. Wow. So it's like a city. And maybe there were other Jewish kids, but I didn't know any of them. And so I had this kind of secret other life that none of my friends in regular life got to have. And then there was a set of friends from that Jewish life that I acquired. It was having a dual identity, which I think is common generally, I would say, for Jews, right? You're a Jew and you're an American, or you're a Jew and you're, whatever, British. I think what's particular about being Jewish and being from Eastern Europe is that when you get to America, what you hear from Jews you meet here is this very different sense of what Eastern Europe means to them. Because I, meet so many Jewish readers, and they ask complicated questions about Ukraine and collaboration. And so it's been on my mind a lot. And I think there is this sense when your relatives, as is common, come from Eastern Europe, the stories you inherit are typically very negative and very small, right? Like Eastern Europe is this place we ran away from, and look at our great life here, right? What you don't get is kind of any of the positive aspects of what life was like beyond the pogroms or, the Holocaust by bullets. For immigrants like myself, what you associate with that place is a lot more complicated than that, right? There are maybe negative things. I mean, we didn't have pogroms or anything as dramatic kind of after World War II, but there's anti-Semitism, and there were ways in which some Jews, not all, were suffering, wanted to express their Jewish identities and couldn't, didn't get the same opportunities as maybe their non-Jewish brethren. But beyond that, it's this place like Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, all of that. It's this place where you maybe fell in love, right? You remember the fields and the forests and all of these positive memories that are often associated with youth, kind of no matter how, maybe objectively it doesn't seem great. Like me living in a communal apartment was objectively pretty shitty. But what I remember about it is pretty great because I was 3, Right. So it's this much more complicated relationship to that place than when I talk to kind of American Jews.
Right. It makes sense. It kind of lives in our collective imagination. And for you, it's a real place with real concrete facts about it. And where and when was this book published?
This book was published, I think, in a Russian publishing house in, I think, New York. I read it. Somebody gave it to me in Russia, and then I took it with me to America and read it, started reading it on the plane, and then continued and kept ever since. I moved a ton ever since, and this is one of the only books I kept. So it's sort of precious.
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood, Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman.
So Vasily Grossman was a Jewish journalist in Soviet Union who was embedded with troops during World War II. It's sort of in the style of War and Peace. It's often called the War and Peace of the 21st century. The first time I ever heard of it was from my Ukrainian grandmother, who was reading it, I think, in the 90s. And she told me that this is the best book of the 20th century, or something like that, or maybe the most important book of the 20th century. It was pitched in this very sort of dramatic way, but it has a terrible name, like Life and Fate. I can't think of a worse title for a novel. It's just so boring and pretentious, So I also knew that it's quite long, and there's something about my grandmother's statement about it that maybe turned me off. But eventually I realized that I absolutely need to read it if I'm ever to write a book about World War II. It is quite long. It's almost 800 pages. I read it in the original in Russian, but it's obviously translated into English. What is probably the most striking for me about Life and Fate is that it has this scene where you are inside the gas chamber. I've never read anything like that. I have no idea how he did it. Like as a writer, when I think about it, I mean, that's, as a fiction writer, right? Your imagination can stretch to a certain degree, but to go there. So there's a scene both inside it, and then there's somebody who's, like one of the guards who's looking at it. I mean, if you don't read the entire book, that's fine. But just if you haven't read it, I would try to find that one chapter and just read that.
I understand that it's the second book of the 2-part series, and the first portion of it also was loyal to Stalinism, and the second part was kind of breaking with it. And that reevaluation of Stalinism also appears in your book. I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Also, since this is a Jewish book podcast, I wanted to say that what I liked about it is that it positions kind of the Jewish part of the World War II story within itself. So it's not a story of, what happened to Soviet Jews during World War II. And neither is my book. I think that's important to have Jewish books that aren't just Jewish books to be read by Jews only, right? Like, that's not a good way to go for Jewish literature.
Having gotten so much recognition for your book from within the Jewish community and having won the Sammy Rohr Prize, I'm curious about that same question. Did you sort of think of your book as a Jewish book? Did you set out to write it having like a Jewish audience in mind, or how did you approach it?
I did not. I neither thought of it as a Jewish book, nor did I set out to target Jewish readers. At the same time, this book couldn't exist unless I answered a research question. And this is not a question that my real grandfather in this real letter to the KGB actually answered, because the KGB did not care about the answer to this question. The question being, how would a Jewish soldier that's captured by Germans able to survive? My grandfather, along with 100,000 other Jewish POWs, fell into the cracks of 2 totalitarian regimes, neither of which have been interested in them or that question or publicizing it in any way. And so before I even set out to write it, I started asking that question. And that is obviously a very Jewish question. And what the difficulty of finding the answer is also a very Jewish experience, because when I asked kind of World War II, like renowned World War II historians who knew a lot about kind of the region and the Eastern Front and what happened there, they did not know the answer to this question. It was in a way too niche. I couldn't figure out how to write this book until I answered that question. And finally, I found these 2 historians that were Jewish and Soviet and had the same question. And they interviewed other survivors who went through the same experience. And from that, I was able to kind of reconstruct and build this story.
Book 3, a book that changed your worldview. Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi.
It is a story of 2 sisters born in Africa who get separated. One stays in Africa and one gets taken as a slave to America. And then it follows both of the families that result from these 2 sisters all the way to basically now. So half of it takes place in Africa, half of it takes place in America, and spans centuries. I mean, that alone is such an undertaking. And for me, even though I lived in the US since I was 13, and I've taken plenty of classes that dealt with the question of African Americans and their history in this country. And yet none of that had the same effect as this book. And none of it explained America to me as this book did. I really feel like it opened my eyes, because what I felt as a person living in the now was I would see certain problems that were obvious, right? Black people getting arrested. And then I knew separately that there was slavery, but there was kind of no bridge in my mind between them, or an explanation as to why this thing that happened kind of a long time ago by now, like how it relates to what their experience is now. And she explained it to me, and she took this global lens and really kind of told the African story as well, which is not something I knew anything about, really. So it's a fascinating book. As craft, it was fascinating. She showed me how to tell a story where you jump through huge swaths of time, help the reader keep track of who's who and how it relates and the themes without getting lost, which I totally stole from her. So all the credit goes to her. And yeah, so that's the 2 reasons I love this book. It's also a book whenever some random person at a bookstore, the airport, asks me, like for a book recommendation, that's the thing I always say. It literally works for everybody. Even my mom, if you knew my mom, she is very fancy taste. And I often hesitate recommending any books to her. And this one she loved. So
if it's good enough for your mom, it works for anybody. I'm curious, you said that it helped you kind of learn about America. Was making sense of America's complex racial relations something that you found confusing?
I did, yeah. Of course, like there's racism of a different sort in Eastern Europe that kind of ebbs and flows, but it's nothing like what America continues to constantly deal with and can't ever seem to solve. And yeah, when you're kind of like a white immigrant, if you say you're in this weird place because you get here, you don't really know anything about like the implications, the racial implications of what being white is, because you come from a place where like most people are white. And I'm actually a little Asian, so mixed, and Jewish and whatever, very mixed. But like none of that was important really over there. And here it's this huge thing. And it was very hard to parse through in a way until this book somehow. I lived in San Francisco where we didn't have very many Black kids in our school. I think we had like 2 literally in this very giant high school. Anyway, it's this entire very complex world that I always had trouble kind of fully understanding beyond just like textbook things that you write in essays in high school.
So you went from being like one of maybe the only Jew in your giant school to then seeing that there were 2 African-American kids in this one.
Yeah, I suppose that's right.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, In the Shadow of the Holocaust, short fiction by Jewish writers from the Soviet Union, translated by Sasha Senderovich and Harriet Murav.
I am reading, so this is an ARC, so it hasn't come out yet, but it's coming out soon, a couple months. This book, it's called In the Shadow of the Holocaust, short fiction by Jewish writers from the Soviet Union. It's translated from Yiddish and Russian. They're all by people who are no longer with us. Some of them were published in the Soviet Union. Some were lost, but I've never heard of any of the writers in this book. And so I wanted to get to know this kind of lost part of Soviet Jewish culture about which you would assume I should know more. And yet it was often kind of so marginalized and hidden away in its own thing, in its own, like there was a journal, apparently in the introduction I read that there was a journal in Yiddish in the Soviet Union that was published from like 1965 until the late 80s. I think a lot of Soviet Jewish writers who are writing in America today, probably most of them are not familiar with these stories and this canon either. So it's a very strange place. Like on the one hand, we come from there and yet we're often unaware. It does focus on the Soviet Holocaust, which is a very different experience than, for American Jews, because the Soviet Jews often returned to live in the exact same places after World War II that these terrible things happened. Like WWII Yar, which is this huge killing site in Kiev. People still live in Kiev today. Now there's a memorial about it, but for many decades, none of these places were memorialized or kind of were secretly memorialized by a small number of Jews, but not recognized by the government. So I've read 3 stories so far. There's a sense of conversation between them. The first story, it's called The Witness, and it's a story of an old Jew who's standing and then says to kind of a random Jewish passerby that he's a witness and that she needs to write down everything he said because he's the only survivor of a camp where, like 1 million people died or something. And then a person arrives, he looks at the pages and is kind of enraged that this isn't enough. And like, how do you complete something like this? How many stories can you tell that would be enough, that would satisfy whatever this urge to like memorialize is? Anyway, so the story ends and then there's a next story. It's very different stylistically by a totally different writer, set in the 70s. And at first I was like, that's an interesting jump kind of from like right after the war into the 70s. And then all of a sudden it mentions the first short story because 2 of the characters in the second one have read it and discussed it. And so in that way, it has this great sense of kind of meandering conversation, a very Jewish thing in itself.
Book 5, the author's latest book, Your Presence is Mandatory, by Sasha Vasilyuk. We alluded to this theme a bit already, which is that Yefim is the main character and his entire adult life is shaped by this one choice. And then the silence around what enabled him to survive is what defines sort of everything that comes after that. And that silence is such a loud presence in the book. So I just wanted you to unpack that a little bit more. And I'm curious if you think that that silence was shaped more by political realities and how much is just attributable to the characters themselves.
That's a great question. And it's something that I continue thinking about, because Soviet Union as a system fell apart in 1991. And my grandfather, as you can tell, did not reveal the truth to us, right? He passed away in 2007, like way years all through kind of democratic rebirth and through a period that was very much into discovering the stories of the past and digging up memory and talking about things that couldn't be talked about before. And yet he didn't. So the question of my real grandfather remains in my mind, but is kind of, as I fictionalized it, this was something that I also had to answer. What is the effect of somebody who's forced into silence? Basically, Yefim is a soldier in Soviet Union as Hitler attacks, and he's captured pretty quickly in the book. He is a POW in Soviet Union. Being a POW was a bad thing. It was a shameful thing. It was a traitorous thing. This was a decision made by Stalin very early in the war because huge numbers of soldiers were being captured. And so he issued a law and order that said, you should be dying instead of giving yourself up to the enemy, nor should you be giving the weapons up to the enemy. And if you don't, we will punish your relatives. And to kind of set an example, his own son, Yakov, was captured, and Stalin arrested his daughter-in-law, so Yakov's wife. I mean, this is very extreme, very 20th century totalitarian regime thinking that is not easy to translate for the modern reader. So that was like one of the challenges for me as a writer, because POWs in America are not considered shameful, right? They're considered as heroic as kind of a soldier who was not captured. Soviet Union lost 27 million people. Such a trend, which is, like an abstract number, obviously, but something like Belarus, which is a country north from Ukraine, lost a quarter of its population. So like every fourth person you've met was dead. So the trauma of this war was humongous, specifically for people that were considered kind of traitors or people that should be ashamed of themselves for not dying or not fighting for the motherland. Included people like POWs. It included people like forced laborers, Ostarbeiters, people who were taken by Germans and carted off to work in Germany, many of whom were women and actually kids and young girls. It included everybody who lived under occupation. So let's say like the entire country of Ukraine was occupied by Germans for 2 years. Those people who did not evacuate and stayed when the Germans left, guess what? Those people who lived on this occupation were now bad. They were like second-class citizens, essentially. So these are millions and millions of people that all of these groups involved. And essentially the thinking was that once you spend a prolonged period of time with the enemy, you could no longer be trusted because you could have been converted. You could have been collaborating. We don't really know what you did. And so, we're going to look at you with suspicion. And we're not only going to look at you with suspicion, we're going to actually make your life harder. So we'll either send you to the gulag, which is kind of the most extreme version. So let's say you spend some time in the concentration camp in Germany. You come back home. You're like, oh, thank God, I'm home. And then guess what? No, you get to hang out for another several years, usually 9, in Siberia in permafrost. Yefim, the main character of the book, is able to avoid that because he manages to keep it a secret in a way that you find out towards the very end of the book. But there's a price to everything. And the price is that he cannot ever be fully honest with people he loves, with his wife, Nina, with his children, with his grandchildren. Like it goes on and on until he passes away. And in a way, he can't really be almost honest with himself. He really has to bury this huge experience. He feels a lot of kind of survivor guilt and PTSD, and yet none of it he can ever talk about. There's kind of bureaucratic difficulties that he has to deal with because he's not who he says he is. What for me was most fascinating in all of this was the silence. In any authoritarian regime, silencing is like number one thing you do. If you want to be an authoritarian ruler, you're gonna shut people up. What's interesting is that if you do it on such a grand scale, the after effects and the aftershocks, how silencing becomes such a part of the culture that's absorbed with like your mother's milk for the next generations, even past the totalitarian regime's existence.
That idea that it was shameful to have been a POW, that's a pretty foreign idea to an American, as you say. I wonder, now as the grandchild of people who lived under that system, does it change how you understand Soviet Jewish identity?
Yes, it does. Because I've been meeting with a lot of readers, Soviet-born readers, many of whom are Jewish. Like it proved to me in a way that the story that to me initially was like a very unique story of this one man and the family, to now see how relevant this is to literally every single family. Every single family that comes from that region had somebody who did not talk, either at all until they passed away and then that's it. Their story was gone, or until they were on their deathbed. It's super common. I hear all the time where person's like, okay, I don't have much time left. Please write down this important thing that happened. There's a podcast I heard of interviews with kind of the forced laborers that I mentioned earlier, most of them women. And now they're like old grandmas, right? And this is the first time they're talking about the subject. And now somebody was asking them about it and they remember it as if it was yesterday. So I'm like, where have they been hiding that within themselves this entire time? But there was this constant refrain of how ashamed they were of this thing that happened to them that wasn't their fault. And that is foreign. That is like as anti-American as it gets. Here we are, place where you can be anybody you want. And there, the thinking is very different. You get to be what we tell you you are.
For yourself now, what feels most meaningful to you about your Jewish identity?
Yeah, my Jewish identity has been a journey, and this book has been actually a big part of it. As I wrote this book, I learned a ton about the Jewish experience in World War II beyond kind of the Western Holocaust narrative that I was very familiar with. That whole experience of me thinking in my 20s that, why do we need another World War II book why do we need another like Holocaust narrative? Is now I've contributed to that genre myself. And it has been found by Jewish readers and recognized as something that kind of completes the puzzle for them. But now I'm trying to be more active and more conscious of reading more Jewish books, like contemporary Jewish books, and kind of trying to fill my own puzzle pieces that have been missing because I was born in a place that took Jewish culture away, that wanted everyone to assimilate and become a good little socialist.
Well, I very much appreciate that filling in the pieces is something that you're doing through books. That's something I certainly relate to. And I also appreciate that your book is a puzzle piece that has been missing, and the beauty of adding to the pantheon of books that are out there is that we get to learn about pieces that we really didn't know. And for me, and I think for so many other readers, this piece of Soviet Jewish history was really missing. So thank you so much for writing this book and for sharing it with us and for being here today.
Thank you, Tali. This was great. Great to talk to you about all this stuff.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 books. Our guest today was Sasha Vasilyuk talking about her book, Your Presence is Mandatory. You can find a link to the book and all the others Sasha discussed in our show notes. If you've read one of the wonderful books recommended on our show, we'd love to hear about it. Drop us a comment on our Instagram @5bookspod or in our email, team@5bookspod.org. If you'd like an email reminder to keep you up to date with new episodes, plus links to all the books we discussed and more directly to your inbox, you can sign up for our newsletter in the show notes or on our website, 5bookspod.org. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Editorial and website support from Amelia Merrill. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Elad Lifshitz of the Dove Abramson Studio. Thanks especially to the Jewish Book Council.